Part 2 of A Long Walk to Water by Linda Sue Park. Southern Sudan, 1985. Salva's eyes were swollen shut. Buxa's forearms were lumpy and raw. A friend of Buxa's had a fat lip. They all looked as though they had been in a terrible fist fight. But their injuries weren't bruises. They were bee stings. A fire had been started under the tree to smoke the bees out of the hive and make them sleepy. But as Buxa and the other charcoal men were removing the hive from the tree, the bees woke up and were not at all happy to discover that their home was being taken away. They expressed their unhappiness very clearly by buzzing, swarming, and stinging a lot. It was worth it, Salva thought as he touched his eye gingerly. His belly was a rounded lump stuffed full of honey and beeswax. Nothing had ever tasted so good as those pieces of honeycomb dripping with rich, luscious gold sweetness. Along with everyone else in the group, he had eaten as much as he could hold, and then a little more. All around him, people were licking their fingers in great satisfaction, except for one Dinka man who had been stung on his tongue. It was swollen so badly that he could not close his mouth. He could hardly swallow. Salva felt very sorry for him. The poor man couldn't even enjoy the honey. The walking seemed easier now that Salva had something in his belly. He had managed to save one last piece of honeycomb and had wrapped it carefully in a leaf. By the end of the next day, all the honey was gone, but Salva kept the beeswax in his mouth and chewed it for the memory of sweetness. The group got a little bigger with each passing day. More people joined them, people who had been walking alone or in little clusters of 2 or 3. Salva made it a habit to survey the whole group every morning and evening, searching for his family, but they were never among the newcomers. One evening, a few weeks after Salva had joined the group, he made his usual walk around the fireside, scanning every face in the hope of seeing a familiar one. Then, ouch! Salva almost lost his footing as the ground underneath him seemed to move. A boy jumped to his feet and stood in front of him. "Hey, that was my hand you stepped on." The boy spoke Dinka, but with a different accent, which meant that he was not from the area around Salva's village. Salva took a step back. "Sorry, are you hurt?" The boy opened and closed his hand a few times, then shrugged. "It's all right, but you really should watch where you're going." "Sorry," Salva repeated. After a moment's silence, he turned away and began searching the crowd again. The boy was still looking at him. "Your family?" he asked. Salva shook his head. "Me too," the boy said. He sighed, and Salva heard that sigh all the way to his heart. Their eyes met. "I'm Salva." "I'm Mariel. It was good to make a friend." Mariel was the same age as Salva. They were almost the same height. When they walked side by side, their strides were exactly the same length. And the next morning, they began walking together. "Do you know where we're going?" Salva asked. Mariel tilted his head up and put his hand on his brow to shade his eyes from the rising sun. "East," he said wisely. "We are walking into the morning sun." Salva rolled his eyes. "I know we're going east," he said. "Anyone could tell that, but where in the east?" Mariel thought for a moment. "Ethiopia," he said. "East of Sudan is Ethiopia." Salva stopped walking. "Ethiopia? That is another country. We can't walk all the way there." "We are walking east," Mariel said firmly. "Ethiopia is east." "I can't go to another country," Salva thought. "If I do, my family will never find me." Mariel put his arm around Salva's shoulders. He seemed to know what Salva was thinking, for he said, "It doesn't matter. Don't you know that if we keep walking east, we'll go all the way around the world and come right back here to the Sudan? That's when we'll find our families." Salva had to laugh. They were both laughing as they started walking again, arm in arm, their strides matching perfectly. More than a month had passed since Salva had run from his school into the bush. The group was now walking in the land of the Atuit people. In the Dinka language, the Atuit are called the people of the lion. Their region was inhabited by large herds of antelope, wildebeest, gnus, and the lions that preyed on them. The Dinka told stories about the Atuit. When the Atuit person died, he came back to earth as a lion with a great hunger for the human flesh he had once had. The lions in the Atuit region were said to be the fiercest in the world. Nights became uneasy. Salva woke often to the sound of roars in the distance and sometimes to the death squeal of an animal under a lion's claws. One morning he woke bleary-eyed after a poor sleep. He rubbed his eyes, rose, and stumbled after Muriel as they began walking yet again. Salva? It was not Muriel who had spoken. The voice had come from behind them. Salva turned. His mouth fell open in amazement, but he could not speak. Salva! Chapter 6. Southern Sudan, 2008. Nia's family had been coming to the lake camp for generations. Nia told herself had been there every year since she was born. One thing she liked about the camp was that even though she had to dig in the clay and wait for water, she did not have to make the 2 long trips to the pond every day. But this year she realized for the first time that her mother hated the camp. They had no house and had to sleep in makeshift shelters. They could not bring most of their things, so they had to make do with whatever was at hand. And for much of each day they had to dig for water. But the worst was the look on her mother's face when Nia's father and older brother Depp went off to hunt. Fear. Her mother was afraid that the men in the family would run into Dinka tribesmen somewhere, that they would fight and get injured, or worse. They had been lucky all these years. No one from Nia's family had been hurt or killed by Dinka, but she knew other families in the village who had lost ones in this way. Nia could see the questions in her mother's face every morning. Would they be lucky again? Or was it now their turn to lose someone? Southern Sudan, 1985. Salva's mouth closed and opened again, as if he were a fish. He tried to speak, but no sound came out of his throat. He tried to move, but his feet seemed stuck to the ground. "Salva," the man said again, and hurried toward him. When the man was only a few steps away, Salva suddenly found his voice. "Uncle!" he cried out, and ran into the man's arms. Uncle Juir was the younger brother of Salva's father. Salva hadn't seen him in at least 2 years because Uncle had been in the army. Uncle must know about the war and the fighting. Maybe he will know where my family is. But these hopes were dashed as soon as Uncle spoke. "Are you alone? Where is your family?" he asked. Salva hardly knew where to begin his answer. It seemed like years since he had run away from his school and into the bush. But he told his uncle everything as best he could. As Salva spoke, Uncle nodded or shook his head. His face became very solemn when Salva told him that he had not seen nor heard a single word of his family in all that time. Salva's voice trailed off, and he lowered his head. He was glad to see Uncle again, but it looked as if he might not be much help either. Uncle was quiet for a moment, then he patted Salva's shoulder. Nephew," he said in a cheerful voice, "we are together now, so I will look after you." It turned out that Uncle had joined the group 3 days earlier, but since there were more than 30 people traveling together, they had not found each other until now. As they began walking, Salva saw that Uncle had a gun, a rifle that he carried on a strap over one shoulder. Already Salva could tell that because of his army experience and because he had a gun, Uncle was seen by the group as a kind of leader. "Yes, when I left the army, they let me keep my rifle," Uncle said, "so I am going to shoot us a fine meal as soon as we come across anything worth eating." Uncle was true to his word. That very day he shot a young antelope, the kind called a topi. Salva could hardly wait for it to be skinned and butchered and roasted. As the smoky, meaty aroma filled the air, he had to keep swallowing the saliva that flooded his mouth. Uncle laughed as he watched Salva gobble down his first piece of the meat. "Salva, you have teeth. You are supposed to use them when you eat." Salva could not reply. He was too busy stuffing another chunk of the delicious charred meat into his mouth. Even though the topi was a small one, there was more than enough meat for everyone in the group, but it did not take long for Salva to regret his haste in eating. After so many weeks of near starvation, his stomach rebelled mightily. He spent most of the night vomiting. Salva was not alone. Whenever his heaving stomach woke him, he would hurry to the edge of the camp to vomit and find others there doing the same. At one point, Salva found himself in a line of 6 people, all in an identical pose, bent over, holding their stomachs and waiting for the next wave of nausea. It might have been funny if he hadn't felt so miserable. The group continued to walk through the land of the Entuit, Every day they saw lions, usually resting in the shade of small trees. Once in the distance, they saw a lion chasing a topi. The topi escaped, but along the path Salva saw the bones of prey that had not been so fortunate. Salva and Mariel still walked together, staying close to Uncle. Sometimes Uncle would walk with the other men and talk seriously about the journey. At those times, Salva and Mariel would drop back respectfully, but Salva always tried to keep Uncle in sight, and he slept near Uncle at night. One day the group began walking in the late afternoon, with hopes of reaching a waterhole before settling down for the night. But there was no water anywhere, though they searched for miles. They kept walking into the night and through the night. For 10 hours they walked, and by dawn everyone was exhausted. Uncle and the other leaders finally decided that the group had to rest. Salva took 2 steps off the path and fell asleep almost before he lay down. He did not wake until he felt Uncle's hand shaking his shoulder. As he opened his eyes, he heard wailing. Someone was crying. Salva blinked away the sleepiness and looked at Uncle, whose face was very solemn. "I am sorry, Salva," Uncle said quietly. "Your friend." "Merrill?" Salva looked around. "He should be somewhere nearby. I don't remember if he slept near me. I was so tired. Perhaps he has gone to find something to eat." Uncle stroked Salva's head as if he were a baby. "I am sorry," he said again. A cold fist seemed to grip Salva's heart. Chapter 7, Southern Sudan, 2008. Nia sat on the floor. She reached out and took her little sister's hand. Akir did not seem to notice. She lay curled on her side, hardly moving, silent except for an occasional whimper. Her silence frightened Nia. Only 2 days earlier, Akir had complained noisily and at length about the pains in her stomach. Nia had been annoyed by all her whining. Now she felt guilty, for she could see that her sister no longer had enough strength to complain. Nia knew many people who suffered from the same illness. First cramps and stomachache, then diarrhea. Sometimes fever, too. Most of the adults and older children who fell ill recovered at least enough to work again, although they might continue to suffer off and on for years. For the elderly and the small children, the illness could be dangerous. Unable to hold anything in their system, many of them starved to death, even with food right in front of them. Nia's uncle, the chief of their village, knew of a medical clinic a few days' walk away. He told Nia's family that if they could take Akir there, doctors would give her medicine to help her get better. But a trip like that would be very difficult for Akir. Should they stay at the camp and let her rest so she might heal on her own? Or should they begin the long, hard walk and hope they reached help in time? Southern Sudan, 1985. The walking began again. Salva shook with terror inside and out. He clung to Uncle like a baby or a little boy, hanging onto his hand or shirt tail when he could, never letting Uncle get farther than an arm's length away. He looked around constantly. Every movement in the grass was a lion stalking, every stillness a lion waiting to spring. Mariel was gone, vanished into the night. He would never have wandered away from the group on his own. His disappearance could mean only one thing: lion. A lion had been hungry enough to approach the group as they slept. A few men had been keeping watch, but in the dark of night, with the wind rippling through the long grass, the lion easily could have crept close without being seen. It had sought out prey that was small and motionless, Mariel sleeping, and it had taken him away, leaving only a few splotches of blood near the path. If it hadn't been for Uncle, Salva might have gone crazy with fear. Uncle spoke to him all morning in a steady, low voice. "Salva, I have a gun. I will shoot any lion that comes near. Salva, I will stay awake tonight and keep watch. Salva, we will soon be out of lion country. Everything will be all right." Listening to Uncle, hurrying to stay close to him, Salva was able to make his feet move despite the cold terror throughout his whole body. But nothing was all right. He had lost his family, and now he had lost his friend as well. No one had heard any screaming in the night. Salva hoped with all his heart that the lion had killed Mariel instantly, and his friend hadn't had time to feel fear or pain. The landscape grew greener. The air smelled of water. "The Nile," Uncle said. "We will soon come to the Nile River and cross to the other side." The Nile, the longest river in the world, the mother of all life in Sudan. Uncle explained that they would come to the river at one of its broadest stretches. It will not even look like a river. It will look like a big lake. We will spend a time crossing to the other side." "And what is on the other side?" Salva whispered, still fearful. "Desert," Uncle answered, "and after that, Ethiopia." Salva's eyes filled with tears. Mariel had been right about Ethiopia. "How I wish he were here so I could tell him I was wrong." Salva stood on the bank of the Nile. Here, as Uncle had said, the river formed a big lake. "The group would cross the Nile in boats," Uncle said. "It would take a whole day to reach the islands in the middle of the lake, and another day to get to the far shore." Salva frowned. He saw no boats anywhere. Uncle smiled at Salva's puzzled expression. "What, you didn't bring your own boat?" he said. "Then I hope you are a good swimmer." Salva lowered his head. He knew that Uncle was teasing, but he felt so tired. Tired of worrying about his family, tired of thinking about poor Muriel, tired of walking and not knowing where they were going. The least Uncle could do was tell him the truth about the boats. Uncle put his arm around Salva's shoulders. "You'll see, we have a lot of work to do." Salva staggered forward with yet another enormous load of reeds in his arms. Everyone was busy. Some people were cutting down the tall papyrus grass by the water's edge. Others, like Salva, gathered up the cut stalks and took them to the boat builders. Among the group were a few people whose home villages had been near rivers or lakes. They knew how to tie the reeds together and weave them cleverly to form shallow canoes. Everyone worked quickly, although there was no way of knowing whether they had to hurry or not, no way of knowing how near the war was. The fighting could be miles away, or a plane carrying bombs could fly overhead at any moment. It was hard work running back and forth between those cutting and those weaving, but Salva found that the work was helping him feel a little better. He was too busy to worry much. Doing something, even carrying big, awkward piles of slippery reeds, was better than doing nothing. Every time Salva delivered a load of reeds, he would pause for a few moments to admire the skills of the boat builders. The long reeds were laid out in neat bunches. Each end of a bunch would be tied together tightly. Then the bunch of reeds was pulled apart in the middle to form a hollow, and the two sides were tied all along their length to make a basic boat shape. More layers of reeds were added and tied to make the bottom of the boat. Salva watched fascinated, as little by little the curve of the prow and the low sides grew from the piles of reeds. It took 2 full days for the group to build enough canoes. Each canoe was tested. A few did not float well and had to be fixed. Then more reeds were tied together to form paddles. At last, everything was ready. Salva got into a canoe between Uncle and another man. He gripped the sides of the boat tightly as it floated out onto the Nile. Chapter 8, Southern Sudan, 2008. It was like music, the sound of Akir's laugh. Nia's father had decided that Akir needed a doctor, so Nia and her mother had taken Akir to the special place, a big white tent full of people who were sick or hurt. With doctors and nurses to help them, after just 2 doses of medicine, Akir was nearly her old self again, still thin and weak, but able to laugh, as Nia sat on the floor next to her cot and played a clapping game with her. The nurse, a white woman, was talking to Nia's mother. Her sickness came from the water, the nurse explained. She should drink only good, clean water. If the water is dirty, you should boil it for a count of 200 before she drinks it. Nia's mother nodded that she understood, but Nia could see worry in her eyes. The water from the holes in the lake bed could be collected only in tiny amounts. If her mother tried to boil such a small amount, the pot would be dry long before they could count to 200. It was a good thing, then, that they would soon be returning to the village. The water that Nia fetched from the pond in the plastic jug could be boiled before they drank it. But what about next year at camp, and the year after that? And even at home, whenever Nia made that long, hot walk to the pond, she had to drink as soon as she got there. She would never be able to stop Akir from doing the same. Southern Sudan, 1985. The lake's surface was calm, and once the boats had pulled away from the shore, there was not much to see, just water and more water. They paddled for hours. The scenery and motion were so monotonous that Salva might have slept, except he was afraid that if he did, he might fall over the side. He kept himself awake by counting the strokes of Uncle's paddle and trying to gauge how far the canoe traveled with every 20 strokes. Finally, the boat pulled up to an island in the middle of the river. This was where the fishermen of the Nile lived and worked. Salva was amazed by what he saw in the fishing community. It was the first place in their weeks of walking that had an abundance of food. The villagers ate a lot of fish, of course, and hippo and crocodile meat as well. But even more impressive were the number of crops they grew. Cassava, sugarcane, yams. It was easy to grow food when there was a whole river to water the crops. None of the travelers had money or anything of value to trade, so they had to beg for food. The exception was Uncle. The fisherman gave him food without having to be asked. Salva could not tell if this was because Uncle seemed to be the leader of the group or because they were afraid of his gun. Uncle shared his food with Salva, a piece of sugar cane to suck on right away, then fish that they cooked over a fire of yams roasted in the ashes. The sugar cane juice soothed the sharpest edge of Salva's hunger. He was able to eat the rest of the meal slowly, making each bite last a long time. At home, Salva had never been hungry. His family owned many cattle. They were among the better-off families in their village of Lunarik. They ate mostly porridge made from sorghum and milk. Every so often, his father went to the marketplace by bicycle and brought home bags of beans and rice. These had been grown elsewhere because few crops could be raised in the dry, semi-desert region of Lunarik. As a special treat, his father sometimes bought mangoes. A bag of mangoes was awkward to carry, especially when the bicycle was already loaded with other goods, so he wedged the mangoes into the spokes of his bicycle wheels. When Salva ran to greet him, he could see the green-skinned mangoes spinning gaily in a blur as his father pedaled. Salva would take a mango from the spokes almost before his father had dismounted. His mother would peel it for him, its juicy insides the same color as her headscarf. She would slice the flesh away from the big, flat seed. Salva loved the sweet slices, but his favorite part was the seed. There was always plenty of fruit that clung stubbornly to the seed. He would nibble and suck at it to get every last shred, making it last for hours. There were no mangoes among the fisherman's great stores, but sucking on his piece of sugar cane reminded Salva of those happier times. He wondered if he would ever see his father riding a bicycle with mangoes in its spokes. As the sun touched the horizon, the fishermen abruptly went into their nets. They weren't really tents, not nets. They weren't really tents, just white mosquito netting hung or draped to make a space so they could lie down inside. Not one fisherman stayed to talk or eat more or do anything else. It was almost as if they all vanished at the same moment. Only a few minutes later, mosquitoes rose up from the water, from the reeds, from everywhere. Huge, dark clouds of them appeared, their high-pitched whine filling the air. Thousands, maybe millions of hungry mosquitoes massed so thickly that in one breath, Salva could have ended up with a mouthful if he wasn't careful. And even if he was, they were everywhere, in his eyes, nose, ears, on every part of his body. The fishermen stayed in their tents the whole night long. They had even dug channels from the inside of the nets to just beyond them so they could urinate without having to leave their little tents. It didn't matter how often Salva swatted at the mosquitoes, or that one swat killed dozens at a time. For every one he killed, it seemed that hundreds more swarmed in to take its place. With their high singing whine constantly in his ears, Salva slapped the wave and waved at them in frustration all night long. No one in the group got any sleep. The mosquitoes made sure of that. In the morning, Salva was covered with bites. The worst ones were in the exact middle of his back where he couldn't reach to scratch. Those he could reach, though, he scratched until they bled. The travelers got into the boats one more time to paddle from the island to the other side of the Nile. The fishermen had warned the group to take plenty of water for the next stretch of their journey. Salva still had the gourd that the old women had given him. Others in the group had gourds too, or plastic bottles, but there were some who did not have a container. They tore strips from their clothing and soaked them in desperate attempt to carry at least a little water with them. Ahead lay the most difficult part of the journey, the Okobo Desert.